Hey guys, tonight we're taking you inside a feast so revolting you'll wonder how anyone crawled out alive, let alone called it dinner. We're not talking about knights clinking goblets in candlelit halls or elegant banquets fit for fairy tales. No, tonight's story is about what it was really like to attend a medieval feast. If you're enjoying our sleepy dives into history, I'd really appreciate a quick like or even a subscribe. It helps way more than you know. And hey, I'm always curious where you're tuning in from. Drop a comment with your city and what time it is for you. Now lay back, close your eyes, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You sit at the long wooden table, a slab of rough timber so greasy with old food that your sleeves cling to it as though the table itself is alive. Before you, a platter arrives, steaming, sizzling, and already suspicious. At first glance, it looks like a generous cut of roasted meat, browned and dripping with fat. But lean closer and you realise the fat doesn't smell right. It carries the sour tang of age, the unmistakable sharpness of something long past its prime. In the medieval world, meat was a prize, a rare luxury for most people, and feasts were supposed to be indulgent displays of plenty. But the reality is that most of the meat served at banquets wasn't fresh. Refrigeration didn't exist, and salted storage could only do so much. By the time a pig, boar or ox made it to the carving table, it had often been hung for days, even weeks, in conditions that encouraged a fragrance far more memorable than appetizing. To mask this, cooks would smother the flesh in a blizzard of spices: cinnamon, cloves, pepper, saffron. Spices were expensive, imported from distant lands, and their very presence was meant to signal wealth and power. But in truth, their greatest use was to cover the fact that the meat beneath them might be halfway to the grave itself. You pick up your knife, a dull blade provided at the table, and saw through the roast. The texture fights back. It is sinewy and dense, with patches of fat that squish under pressure, refusing to slice neatly. A bite confirms the worst. The flavour is sour, like chewing on leather marinated in vinegar and regret. The spices overwhelm at first, burning your tongue, but beneath them the meat reveals itself as what it is: spoiled. And yet, everyone around you digs in without hesitation. People in the Middle Ages were more accustomed to tastes that modern palates would reject instantly. Meat that would be condemned today as unsafe was then considered perfectly edible if you could drown it in sauce or boil it until stringy. Even wealthy banquets were not free of this problem. In fact, feasts sometimes amplified it, because they demanded quantity above all else. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of guests needed to be fed, which meant stockpiling carcasses for weeks in smokehouses or salted barrels. The result was food that could both impress and poison in equal measure. The hall reeks of roasting fat mixed with the stench of smoke from the open hearth. Dogs bark at the edges of the table, their noses twitching, waiting for bones to be tossed. The clatter of knives and the grunt of diners fill the air, punctuated by laughter that sounds just a little too eager. You chew slowly, swallowing against the lump rising in your throat, and wonder how many here will wake tomorrow clutching their stomachs in agony. Foodborne illness was rampant in this era. Dysentery, food poisoning and fevers from spoiled meat were common consequences of overindulgence. Accounts from the time describe noble guests falling ill after banquets, some even dying days later from what was likely a meal gone bad. And yet the tradition continued, because feasting wasn't about nourishment, it was theatre. It was a display of wealth, an advertisement of power, a way to show that you could provide not only enough food to feed your guests, but enough to drown them in excess. As you push the spoiled roast to the side, a servant lays down another platter, this time a bird roasted whole, feathers still clinging to its skin in patches, beak intact, glassy eyes staring out. The presentation is meant to impress, but all you can think of is how long it must have sat before it reached the fire. The smell confirms it. Beneath the sweet glaze of honey and herbs is the unmistakable hint of rot. You take a bite anyway, because to refuse would be an insult, and at this table insults carry consequences. The warmth of the fire roars behind you, making the air hot and heavy. Sweat drips down your temple, mixing with the grease already smeared across your lips. You hear the sound of someone gagging down the table, followed by forced laughter, as though they swallowed their protest along with their meat. This is what survival looks like at a medieval feast. Chew quickly, swallow faster, and pray your stomach doesn't revolt before the night is over. The first course is finished, but already you feel the weight of the meat pressing on your insides, your throat coated in grease, and yet the feast has only just begun. The meat may have left your mouth coated in spices and regret, but now comes the vessel that makes everything worse. The trencher. It's not a plate, not really. It's a slab of bread, usually yesterday's loaf or the day before's, cut thick enough to hold a pile of food. Soft bread was wasted on the rich because fresh bread was for eating, not serving. Trencher bread was tough, baked hard, meant to absorb grease, gravy, and anything else dripping across the table. One is slapped down in front of you. The crust is blackened in patches from the oven's uneven heat, and the surface already smells faintly of sour yeast. Before you can hesitate, a ladle of oily stew is poured directly onto it. The bread groans under the weight, sagging, soaking, slowly turning into something closer to a sponge than a meal. Bits of sinew, fat, and bone tumble onto the makeshift plate, sliding across its surface as the grease spreads outward. By the time you lift it, the trencher already leaks through, your fingers slick with its contents. Everyone else at the table tears into theirs without thought. Etiquette at a feast demanded enthusiasm, not delicacy. You are expected to devour your trencher, juices running down your chin, to show appreciation for the abundance provided. Forks were rare in most parts of medieval Europe until much later, so fingers did the work. Diners tore at the sodden bread with greasy hands, then used the same hands to rip at meat, swipe at sauces, and pass jugs of ale along the table. If you're worried about germs, you should be. Nobody at this banquet is washing their hands. Hygiene was a nightmare. Medieval people had little understanding of microbes, and while some households enforced basic washing, most feasts were too chaotic for such courtesies. Communal bowls of water were sometimes provided, but these quickly turned into cloudy soup from everyone dipping their dirty hands. Guests wiped their fingers on the tablecloth, on their tunics, or directly on the dogs milling beneath the benches. A medieval feast wasn't just about sharing food, it was about sharing everything: grease, spit, and the occasional parasite. The trencher beneath your stew is starting to collapse. The bread absorbs so much fat that when you try to tear off a piece, it stretches like wet leather. Its texture is spongy and gummy, sticking to your teeth. The stew itself is a slurry of overcooked vegetables, stringy meat, and a sauce that smells faintly sour. To master flavour, the cook has added onions in bulk, their sharpness cutting through the rot but leaving your breath just as deadly. Once you've had your fill, or at least convinced those around you that you've tried, you're faced with the question of what to do with the trencher itself. In theory, it's edible. In practice, it's a bacteria-soaked sponge that has sat through an entire course of greasy food. The wealthy often ignored theirs, letting them pile up as evidence of abundance. Servants and the poor, however, would take the discarded trenchers afterward, eating them cold and soggy, days after the feast ended. By then, the bread had soaked up not just juices, but whatever germs thrived on the wooden tables and in the air of the smoky hall. For many, this was the only chance at a filling meal, and sometimes it was their undoing. You glance at the end of the table where the dogs growl over a discarded trencher, their teeth tearing it into strips. Somewhere beyond them, a servant scoops up the leftover loaves into a basket, not for the waste pile, but for the poor waiting outside the hall. Charity was a ritual part of many feasts, but charity in this case meant passing down the dangerous leftovers. To be fed by a lord was considered a blessing. To survive, it was a different story. The hall is stifling now, thick with the smell of wet bread, roasted fat and sweat. Candles gutter in the smoky air, dripping wax down iron holders. The noise is deafening. Slurping, chewing, laughing, belching, coughing. Every trench of bread has become a battlefield, collapsing under the grease and germs, and yet for the guests this is the height of luxury. Food is abundant, wine is flowing, and the air rings with noise. The dangers are invisible, tucked into the soggy corners of the bread. By the time the trenches are cleared, your stomach churns with grease, and your fingers are sticky with sauce. You glance down the table at the guests still chewing, some gnawing on their trenchers like dogs with bones. In the flickering light, you realise that survival at a medieval feast isn't just about what you eat. It's about what the food is sitting on. The trenchers are gone, but your thirst is growing. Unfortunately, water isn't the answer. In the medieval world, most water was suspect. Wells could be contaminated by waste, rivers filled with filth, and stagnant pools were breeding grounds for disease, which meant the only truly safe option, at least by medieval standards, was to drink something brewed or fermented. At a feast, that meant ale, lots of it. A jug is passed to you, its clay sides slick with condensation. The smell hits before the liquid touches your lips. It's yeasty, sour, with a faint must of damp straw. Medieval ale was not the golden, frothy drink that modern breweries produce. It was often cloudy, sometimes weak, sometimes strong, and almost always inconsistent. Brewing was done locally, often in small batches, and recipes varied wildly. Some ales were thin, barely more than flavoured water. Others were so heavy and alcoholic that a few cups could send you reeling. You tilt the jug and watch the liquid slosh into your wooden cup. It is cloudy, with floating bits that catch the flicker of torchlight. A sip confirms the smell. Sharp, sour, grainy. It fills your mouth with the taste of wet bread, and not the good kind. Still, it is safer than water. At least safer in the sense that the alcohol kills off some of the worst offenders. What it doesn't save you from is the hangover waiting in the morning, or the stomach cramps that might follow a poorly brewed batch. Wine arrives next, a luxury imported for the wealthier tables. In theory, it should be better. In practice, it is often worse. Medieval wine was rarely aged the way modern wines are. It spoiled quickly, turning into something more akin to vinegar. To salvage it, servers mixed in honey, herbs, and even chalk to improve the flavour. A sip tastes both sweet and acrid, the honey coating your tongue while the sourness claws at the back of your throat. It's a drink that can only be tolerated, never enjoyed. You glance down the table as goblets are raised and emptied in quick succession. Drinking was not a gentle pastime, it was a test of endurance. Guests were expected to keep pace with their hosts, toasting loudly, refilling constantly, drinking until the room blurred and the laughter turned into a dull roar. Sobriety at a feast was suspicious. To drink little was to risk being seen as ungrateful, even insulting. So you drink more. The ale sloshes in your stomach, mixing with the spoiled meat and greasy bread. Already your insides feel like a churn, a cauldron bubbling over a hearth. Around you, the effects are visible. A noble at the far end of the table laughs so hard he topples backward off the bench. A servant rushes to refill a goblet and spills ale across the floor, where a dog laps it up eagerly. The hall smells now not only of food and smoke, but of spilled drink seeping into the floorboards. Brewing ale required vast quantities of grain, and in some years this demand worsened famines. In towns, alehouses brewed daily, producing what was called small ale, a weak version meant for everyday drinking. But at feasts, stronger brews dominated. This was less about taste and more about display. The more potent the ale, the more generous the host appeared, and the more likely the guests were to stagger home in a haze, their judgment clouded, their stomachs churning. By now your head feels heavy, and the room sways slightly in the flickering light. The torches blur, and the roar of laughter sounds distant, muffled as though wrapped in wool. You take another sip anyway, because it would be impolite to refuse. The jug keeps coming back, carried by servants who refill it before it's even half empty. Wine, ale, wine again. The cycle never ends. Somewhere a guest retches into the rushes that cover the floor and nobody bats an eye. The rushes are meant to soak up such accidents, along with spilled food, bones and worse. By morning the floor will be a swamp of filth, and by next week it will reek beyond measure. But for now the feast continues, the flow of drink unending, the river of ale swallowing every sense. Your mouth is dry from the salt-heavy meat, your stomach is heavy with grease, and the ale only adds to the burden. You drink more anyway, because to stop is to stand out, and at this table, standing out is the most dangerous choice of all. The jugs keep moving, the goblets keep rising, and you feel the night sliding away in a haze. The hall grows hotter as the courses pile up, the air thick with the mingled scents of smoke, sweat and meat fat. But now something sweeter drifts across the table. Cinnamon, cloves, ginger, saffron, nutmeg. The fragrances of lands you'll never see, carried in little bags by merchants who risk deserts, seas and pirates to bring them here. These spices were rarer than gold, prized so highly that to use them in abundance was a sign of staggering wealth. A dish is laid before you, glistening in a sauce so fragrant that for a moment you forget the sour meat beneath. This is the alchemy of medieval cooking. Drown the rot in enough saffron and cinnamon, and the smell alone convinces you it's edible. Spices were the medieval version of Greasy, except much more expensive and less effective once the bite hit your tongue. You cut into the dish and chew. The flavour is strange, a clash of sweet and savoury that doesn't quite work. Medieval cuisine adored mixing opposites. Meats cooked with fruit, fish with sugar, eggs with cinnamon. Dishes that might sound exotic on parchment taste confusing in your mouth. The sweetness masks the sourness, but only for a moment. Soon the meat's true nature seeps through, sour juices mingling with spice until your stomach lurches. Then comes the sugar itself. Refined sugar in this period was a luxury so expensive it was locked away like treasure. Yet here, at a feast, it flows freely. Candied nuts, honey cakes, and moulded sugar sculptures appear. Delicate works of art meant less for eating than for impressing. The wealthy might even dye sugar into bright colours and shape it into birds or castles. These sugar marvels are paraded before the table, admired, then broken apart for guests to taste. You reach for a piece, its surface hard and crystalline. The sweetness is overwhelming, coating your tongue in syrupy grit. Your teeth ache instantly. Medieval sugar was not the refined powder you know today, but coarse, lumpy, and often mixed with impurities. Grindstones sometimes left tiny flecks of grit in the final product, so chewing could feel more like eating sand than candy. Still, the rush of sweetness is irresistible after so much sour meat and bitter ale. You eat more, and your stomach protests immediately. Stomachaches were a common legacy of medieval feasts. The sudden intake of rare luxuries, spices, sugar, sweetened wine, hit bodies unaccustomed to them. Most peasants lived on bread, pottage, and the occasional scrap of meat. Their digestive systems were not prepared for mountains of sugar or rivers of spice. Even the wealthy suffered. Accounts from the time mention noblemen collapsing after banquets, doubled over from indigestion, their bodies rebelling against the very luxuries they flaunted. The hall is a cacophony now. Laughter, belches, the scrape of knives on wood. Dogs bark under the table as sticky scraps are tossed their way. Children run between the benches, their fingers sticky with sugar, smearing it on the floor and each other. Servants rush to bring more dishes, the plates growing stranger as the courses multiply. You sip from your goblet, hoping the ale will wash down the sweetness, but it only makes it worse. The sugar curdles with the sourness, a storm brewing in your gut. Around you, others keep eating, tearing into candied fruits, dipping greasy meat into spiced sauces, licking their fingers as though each course were a miracle. The air smells of cinnamon and honey, but beneath it the unmistakable undertone of rot lingers. Your stomach tightens. You shift uncomfortably on the bench, feeling sweat bead on your forehead. The feast is meant to impress, and it does. just not in the way you hoped. It impresses upon you how much food the human body can endure before it decides enough is enough. But you cannot stop. The next dish is already arriving, steaming and pungent, and all you can do is brace yourself. Because at a medieval feast, the eating never ends until the guests begin to fall. The food is only half the ordeal. In fact, sometimes the real point of a medieval feast wasn't what was on the table, but what happened between bites. You shift on the hard bench, wiping grease from your fingers onto the tablecloth that looks more like a battlefield than linen, and just as you're beginning to dread the next course, a sudden blare of sound erupts. Pipes, drums and voices echo through the smoky hall, cutting through the haze of ale. The entertainment has arrived. At first it's music, loud, brash, and impossible to ignore. Minstrels pluck at lutes, blowing horns that rattle your aching head. The melodies are not gentle lullabies, but quick, lively jigs meant to stir the crowd back into action. After hours of eating, the energy of the hall is flagging. This music is meant to jolt everyone awake, to keep the feast alive. Unfortunately for you, it only makes your full stomach churn harder. Then come the performers. A man strides into the centre of the hall, juggling knives slick with torchlight. Another follows, tumbling across the rushes that are already soggy with spilled ale and scraps of meat. Acrobats leap into the air, their hands slapping the grimy floor with each roll. Every thud makes the table tremble, rattling your goblet. The crowd roars with approval, mouths full, hands clapping with greasy palms. Medieval feasts often included elaborate displays of entertainment. Jugglers, jesters, minstrels, even trained animals were brought in to amuse guests while the next course was being prepared. Some lords staged elaborate masks, with performers dressed in costumes meant to represent mythical figures, saints, or allegories of virtue. The irony, of course, was that virtue was in short supply at a table where half the guests were already slurring their words from drink. You blink through the smoke as servants carry in a new marvel, a pie the size of a shield. It looks ordinary at first until the crust cracks open and live birds burst out, flapping wildly across the hall. Guests laugh and clap, delighted by the absurdity, while you duck instinctively as wings brush against your face. This wasn't a fantasy. Medieval cookbooks genuinely describe recipes where live birds were baked into pies as a form of spectacle. Never mind that the pie itself, by the time it reached the table, was cold, stale, and inedible. The birds were the real dish. The noise grows unbearable. Someone begins a drunken song, pounding the table in rhythm, ale sloshing everywhere. Others join in, their voices off-key but booming. The music, the shouting, the clatter of knives, the barking of dogs, and the frantic flutter of trapped birds combine into a cacophony that presses against your skull. You sit in the middle of it, stomach heavy, head swimming, sweat dripping, wondering how much more the human body can take. Entertainment at medieval feasts could be far stranger still. There are accounts of performers dressed as wild men covered in pitch and feathers, running through halls with torches, sometimes setting themselves, and occasionally the hall, on fire. The line between spectacle and disaster was thin. Guests wanted shock, absurdity, something memorable to boast about later. Whether it was dangerous or nauseating hardly mattered. A man beside you bangs his goblet on the table, demanding more drink, his face red and glistening. Across from him, another guest sways unsteadily, eyes closing as though the performance has lulled him into a drunken stupor. The dogs are snapping at each other now, fighting over bones tossed to the floor, their snarls adding to the chaos. Above it all, the jester capers, bells jingling as he mocks the guests themselves, his words lost in the roar. For you, there is no escape. The entertainment does not give you rest between courses. It only heightens the sensory overload. Bright torchlight, blaring sound, the press of bodies, the stink of grease and sweat. You can feel your stomach gurgling with every drumbeat, your head pounding in time with the horns. And just when you think it cannot get worse, a servant pushes through the performers carrying another steaming platter, the next course ready to be devoured. The hall cheers. The entertainment is over, and the eating begins again. By now your stomach is heavy and your head swims, but even worse than the food or the noise is the air itself. The feast has been going for hours, and the hall is alive with smells that no candle or bundle of herbs can hide. You breathe in and instantly regret it. The first layer is smoke. The fire pit at the centre of the hall burns constantly, meant to provide warmth and roast meat, but the chimney draws poorly. Thick black smoke rolls into the rafters and pools above the crowd before drifting down in slow waves. Your eyes sting and water, and every breath tastes like burnt wood and fat. You cough, but your hacking disappears into the roar of laughter and music. Beneath the smoke is the smell of meat, not the pleasant aroma of a Sunday roast, but the greasy staleness of overcooked flesh, its juices seeping into the rushes on the floor. The scent clings to your clothes, your hair, even your skin. A single touch to your sleeve confirms it. The wool is slick with grease, the fabric reeking like a butcher's apron. Then there is sweat. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of bodies are packed into the hall, shoulder to shoulder, jostling for space at the table. The fire makes the air stifling, turning the room into a furnace. Guests wipe their brows with greasy hands, smear sweat across tunics, and shake it loose as they laugh and sing. The smell is sharp, sour, and unrelenting. You're trapped in a cloud of human odour, mixed with the heavy perfume somewhere in a futile attempt to disguise it. The result is not better, it is worse. On the floor, the rushes add their own contribution. At the start of the evening, the floor was strewn with fresh herbs and reeds, meant to soak up spills and add a hint of fragrance. Hours later, they're a swamp. Ale, grease, spit, and vomit seep into the reeds, until the stench rises in waves whenever someone stomps or slips. Dogs prowl through it, their paws dragging the muck across the room, their fur carrying the stench wherever they go. When they shake, drops splatter across the benches. And of course there are the chamber pots. In theory, guests should excuse themselves. In practice, many did not. Some relieved themselves directly into the rushes, others into pots discreetly tucked against the walls. Servants were meant to empty them, but servants were busy with food and drink. By the time the night wore on, the corners of the hall smelled of waste, sharp and unmistakable. Yet nobody seemed to mind. This was part of feasting, the mingling of indulgence and filth, luxury and squalor. You shift on your bench, trying to breathe shallowly, but the air presses against you from every side. It is thick, wet, and heavy. Each mouthful of food only intensifies it. Spices mingle with smoke, wine with sweat, sugar with rot. Every swallow comes with the taste of the room itself, as though the feast is not just in your mouth, but in your lungs. In medieval accounts, hosts sometimes burned herbs like rosemary or lavender to freshen the air, scattering them across the rushes. But these measures were drowned beneath the stench of the feast itself. Imagine sprinkling perfume on a dung heap and calling it clean. By the time a feast reached its peak, the smell was a living thing, clinging to every guest, every surface, every breath. The noise grows louder as the smell grows worse. Guests shout over one another, singing, laughing, demanding more ale to dull their senses. A man beside you sneezes violently, spraying the table, and without hesitation he wipes his nose on his sleeve and keeps eating. Across the hall, someone coughs until their face turns red, then gulps wine to soothe their throat. Germs thrive here, carried in every cough, every sneeze, every touch of a greasy hand on a shared jug. You close your eyes for a moment, but it doesn't help. The smell is everywhere. It fills your nose, coats your throat, presses against your skin. When you open them again, the hall looks different. You realize it is not just the feast you're enduring. It is the ecosystem of the hall itself. Smoke, filth, sweat, waste, food, all mingling together in a storm that no body can truly survive unscathed. And just as you wonder how long this can last, another platter arrives, steaming and pungent, promising to add yet another layer to the scent that has already conquered the room. You feel it before you admit it. A slow pressure begins behind your ribs and creeps upward like a tide that refuses to turn. The hall still roars with music and laughter, yet the sound now rises on the faint hum that settles in your ears when the body moves from celebration to surrender. Heat gathers at the base of your neck. Your tunic clings. You do not need another bite, but the platters keep arriving as if the kitchen intends to conquer you through sheer persistence. You lift the spoon anyway. Everyone does. At a medieval feast, appetite is theatre and the audience is ruthless. The courses have stretched for hours, not the neat sequence you would recognise, but a parade of roasts and stews and pies, each carried high for display, each urged upon you by servants determined to show the house's generosity. Generosity means refilling your trencher the moment it shows a patch of bread, pushing the largest slice to whoever looks like they might faint from fullness, topping your cup before the previous swallow has reached your stomach. Refusal is ungrateful, hesitation is suspicious, appetite is loyalty, so you perform. The first signs of trouble are small: a swallow that will not go down without a second gulp, a hiccup that tastes of pepper and tallow, sweat beads along your brow even though the fire has not grown hotter. Your stomach feels layered now. The bottom is stale ale and the remains of stringy meat. Above it sits a sludge of sweet wine and honeyed nuts. On top of that lies a slab of trencher and gravy that has turned into a paste too thick to swallow and too stubborn to forget. Every new bite presses against this tower and trembles there like a stone balanced on a mound of wet clay. You can almost hear your insides negotiating terms. Around you, the hall performs its usual denial. A man thumps his chest and reaches for a second helping of something boiled into submission. Another slaps the table and demands spiced wine, an attempt to convince his stomach that heat will help. Bread is offered as a cure for everything, then followed by more meat that undoes any mercy the bread might have provided. The floor whispers with the soft slide of rushes underfoot as guests shift their weight to relieve the pressure in their bellies. The air grows sweeter as the servers carry hippocras down the line, the spiced wine favoured at the end of meals. You raise your cup because everyone else raises theirs. The cinnamon rises to your nose like incense at a funeral. This is how overeating works here, not as a rare mistake, but as a built-in ending. Medieval feasting culture celebrates excess as proof that the host commands resources beyond necessity. The kitchen piles the tables because scarcity shadows the year, and victory over scarcity is measured in leftovers and vertical stacks of trenchers. Lent and fast days can be strict, with meat forbidden on many holy days and fish or almond milk substituted to keep rules and appearances. Feasts answer that restraint by swinging to the other extreme, not simply breaking the fast but smashing it to pieces. The body obeys the calendar, then pays for it. You try to slow your breathing. It helps for a moment, then the pressure returns. You can feel your pulse in your temples. The room smells of smoke and warm ale and human heat. You place one hand on the table to steady yourself and the wood leaves your palms slick with grease. The music quickens. Your stomach answers by tightening. You think of escape, but the benches pack you in shoulder to shoulder, and the door looks a very long way off through the fog of torchlight and bodies. Someone near you mutters about the virtues of fennel and anise for wind, and you watch as a bowl of little seeds makes a slow circuit. People pinch them and toss them into their mouths, chewing carefully like penitents gnawing tiny promises. It is not foolishness. Medieval herb lore is a working memory of what soothed and what did not. Mint helps a cramped stomach. Caraway eases gas. Ginger warms a cold gut and persuades sluggish food to keep moving. The cooks have already used many of these in the dishes, but the quantities drown beneath the tide of fat and sugar. What you chew now is a last line of defence. Across the hall, a guest rises too quickly and sways, hand on the trestle, face pale beneath the torchlight. The nearest servant offers hippocras, and a laugh to fold the wobble back into the performance of merriment. Another guest leans forward, elbows on trencher, head bowed in the universal prayer of those who have underestimated their own capacity. The rushes hide the evidence that follows. Dogs investigate with interest. The music plays on. Your own body begins to join the litany of the aftercourse. There is the press behind the breastbone that warns of what might return the way it came. There is the bruised deep ache of a stomach wall stretched past comfort. There is the cramp that comes in small, mean waves, too polite to be a true spasm, yet determined to claim your attention. The heat climbs your neck again. You sip water because desperation makes poor decisions, then remember why no one trusts it and chase it with ale like an apology. Medieval medicine names your condition plainly. Gluttony disturbs the humours. Food taken beyond measure corrupts in the stomach, generating wind and thick phlegm that weighs the body down. Physicians advise moderation, movement after meals, and purges when necessary. Bloodletting punctuates the year like a ritual broom for the body. Laxatives have their place in the household chest, from gentle senna to stern aloe, often folded into honeyed electuaries that taste better than they behave. Clysters wait as a last argument when the belly refuses all appeals. The remedies are practical in their way. A heavy diet needs help moving, and the line between remedy and ritual is thin when discomfort is a familiar visitor. You have no physician at your elbow, only a bench full of equals determined to pretend. So you do the remedies that are possible here. You straighten your back to make more room for a stomach that wants to expand. You chew the seeds. You breathe carefully through your nose because the mouth betrays you with every swallow of air. You stop looking at the food. Your eyes find the rafters where cured meat once hung when the season allowed, and you imagine the cool of night wind slipping through loose roof tiles. It helps. Then a server lays a sugar-laden marchpane in front of you, almond paste pressed into a castle and glazed until it shines, and the small window of relief slams shut. Every feast has a story about someone who failed to navigate this moment, a guest who ate too quickly and fell silent, a host who insisted on one more course and spent the next day regretting pride. Overeating is not a private mistake here. It is spectacle. People chuckle about it the next morning the way they discuss spilled ale or a performer who stumbled. The sin is routine. The consequences are not always mild. Gout gnaws at swollen joints in those who live like this often. Rich meat and sweet wine pooling where the blood paces slowly. Stomach fevers take their tithe after certain nights, especially when shellfish rode too far inland on a hot cart or lampreys arrived proud and perilous. The body remembers every course even when memory tries to forget the details. Your own evening begins to narrow to small tasks. Sit without compressing the belly. Keep the eyes half-lidded against the torches so the room does not tilt. Drink only when the cup comes to you, and then only enough to keep the mouth from turning to wool. Nod when spoken to, though speech would jostle the coils inside. Breathe. Let the music pass through rather than strike you full in the chest. Time slows into a thick syrup, and you ride it. After a while, the servants shift to clearing rather than serving. This is not tender mercy. It is simply the hour when even abundance must yield to the night. The last trays pass, and the few who still have room make a show of taking one more bite. Someone proposes a pledge to the house and raises a cup that most only pretend to sip. The door opens and the first true breath of tolerable air slips into the hall like a rumour that there is still a world outside. You stand carefully. Your knees report their condition in a small shiver that travels up your thighs. The bench complains across the rushes as you edge along it. The table leaves a damp mark on your tunic where you used it to pull yourself upright. The smell rises as your movement disturbs the layers on the floor. Your stomach folds itself into an argument about whether to forgive you tonight or postpone the trial until morning. Outside is cold. It bites your cheeks with clean teeth. The contrast is violent and welcome. You breathe deeply because you can. Behind you, the hall continues to exhale heat and sound through the doorway, but the air out here seems to scrape the inside of your lungs in a way that feels medicinal. Your stomach does not settle, but it stops climbing. You stand very still and let the night climb into you. Sleep will not come easily. Medieval beds were often shared, and snoring lends a chorus to the darkness. Mattresses are stuffed with straw or reeds that crunch when you shift and greet damp with a sour smell. You will lie there with your belly sending news in small waves. Sometimes the news is urgent, sometimes it is only a threat. Either way the night stretches, you promise yourself breakfast will be modest, bread and a little broth if fortune is kind. The promise is sincere in the dark. Promises made after feasts often are. Morning is when the reckoning takes its full shape. For some, the price is light, a woolly tongue and a stomach that scolds for a few hours. For others, the price is heavier. There is a reason so many household notes include recipes for barley water and thin pottages that ask almost nothing of the gut. There is a reason gardens put aside space for mint and fennel and horehound. There is a reason travel plans made for the day after a feast are called ambitious. When you do rise, you will reach for the customary rescue plan, something warm but not rich to wake the stomach without startling it. Perhaps a posset of warm milk and ale made gentle with honey. Perhaps oat pottage that looks like a punishment but behaves like a cure. You will move slowly because movement persuades, and the body learns quickly that slow persuasion is better than force. If you are lucky, there will be a walk under grey sky while the kitchen empties yesterday's trenches to the poor, and washes the platters with sand that grates and scours. If you are less lucky, there will be work that asks you to bend at the waist. The body will send its opinion on bending. What remains is not only discomfort, it is memory. The belly holds grudges longer than pride. It remembers the way sugar turned to grit on your teeth, the way spiced wine blossomed into heartburn, the way the press of bodies turned air into soup. It also remembers the strange glow of surviving something designed to overwhelm you. That is the odd arithmetic of medieval feasting. The pain is part of the proof that you were there, and that your host was grand enough to topple you. By the time the sun reaches its short arc and begins to fall, you will feel almost yourself again. You will swear softly that moderation is a virtue. Then the messenger will arrive with news that another household plans a celebration next week for reasons that may be religious or political or simple pride dressed as piety. Invitations are not really questions. You will nod. You will say it will be an honour. You will remember fennel. For now, you stand quietly with the morning in your lungs and the last of the feast settling into whatever corner of the body agrees to hold it. You made it through the night without wagering everything on a sprint to the corner pot. You are not triumphant, but you are upright, in this world that counts as victory, and the feast is not finished with you. It lingers in the joints and the breath and the memory of your tongue. It will return at midday as a faint echo under the taste of broth. It will return at night when the fire is banked and the house smells faintly of yesterday. This is the true aftermath, not a dramatic collapse, but a quiet procession of small discomforts that shadow every indulgence. You tell yourself that next time you will stop before the March pain arrives. You tell yourself that you will drink more small ale and less of the strong. You tell yourself that you will watch the servants for the first sign of a dish that has travelled too far to be trusted. You tell yourself many sensible things in the thin light of morning. The kitchen tells its own truth. Knives thud against boards. Pots hiss. Someone laughs as if night never made a claim on them at all. The house resets, because houses always reset after people do foolish things inside them. You take another slow breath and accept what the body already knows. You survive the feast. Now you must survive the part that comes after. The feast does not end when the eating stops. The real reckoning begins when the food leaves the table and begins its journey through every body in the hall. If the trenchers were soggy and the ale sour, what follows is inevitable. And in the medieval world, sanitation was a word that existed only in theory. You shift on the bench, the weight in your gut growing more insistent. Around you, others fidget, some clutching their stomachs, some hiccuping loudly, others coughing into their sleeves. The dogs under the table whine, restless, snapping up bones and scraps, but also pouring through piles of refuse now ankle-deep in the rushes. Every step squelches. The floor is a living sponge of grease, spit, beer, and worse. Medieval households replaced the rushes maybe twice a year. The reeds and herbs scattered on the floor at the start of the feast were supposed to be fresh and fragrant. By now they are blackened and foul, soaked through with every spill of the evening. Servants occasionally rake them, but raking only stirs the stench, sending new waves of rot into the air. Walking across the hall is like trudging through compost. And then there are the chamber pots. At first they seem like a kindness, vessels tucked discreetly into corners or in side chambers just off the hall, but they are small, they fill quickly, and servants often fail to empty them in time. Guests, half drunk and desperate, use them sloppily, missing the mark or simply abandoning the effort altogether. Some choose the rushes themselves as easier targets, and with so many bodies packed in, with ale and wine flooding through every stomach, the hall soon acquires the unmistakable reek of human waste. Disease thrives here. The link between filth and sickness is not yet understood, but everyone knows that feasts sometimes end with half the guests bedridden. Dysentery stalks through every hall like an uninvited guest. Stomach cramps, fever, vomiting, diarrhea. These are the real courses of the banquet, the ones that follow you home long after the torches burn out. Chronicles from the time occasionally mention outbreaks after grand celebrations, sudden waves of illness spreading through noble households. The feast was both spectacle and petri dish. You shift again, uneasy, your own stomach reminding you that you're part of the system whether you wish it or not. A cough to your left sprays droplets across the table. A sneeze to your right is wiped with a greasy hand, then that same hand passes you the jug of ale. The very act of sharing meant as hospitality is a weapon against you. Germs leap from cup to cup, hand to hand, trench to trench, and there are no remedies strong enough to stop it once it begins. The latrines outside the hall are no better. If you make the mistake of leaving the heat of the feast to relieve yourself, you will find a wooden shed, or sometimes just a pit lined with the rough planks, buzzing with flies even in winter. The stench is overpowering. Waste pours directly into cesspits that overflow into nearby ditches, seeping into water supplies, attracting rats and insects in clouds. When the wind shifts, the smell drifts back toward the hall, mingling with the smoke and spice until you can't tell where one ends and the other begins. You imagine the morning after. Servants will rake the rushes into baskets heavy with filth and dump them outside into middens already piled high with refuse from the kitchens. Dogs, pigs and crows will pick through it, dragging scraps across the yard. Chamber pots will be sloshed into open drains, carried toward the river where washerwomen kneel to scrub linen. The same river that provides drinking water to half the town. The cycle is complete, and it begins again with the next feast. The very walls of the hall absorb it. Stone darkens with soot and grease. Wooden beams sweat with smoke. Every surface is sticky, alive with residue. Even the tapestries meant to impress are stained with food and drink, their embroidered knights and saints now permanently shadowed by grease splatters. You shift again, realizing that your sleeve sticks faintly to the bench, as though the wood itself has become saturated with centuries of banquets. For the guest, this is simply normal. No one comments, no one complains. A medieval feast is as much about filth as it is about food. To survive it, you must accept the smells, the mess, the germs. You must accept that your stomach will be tested, that your skin will crawl, that your lungs will choke on smoke. This is not just a meal, it is an assault of every sense. The torches sputter, the laughter rises, the cups clink again, and all you can do is breathe shallowly and pray your body holds its line until the feast is truly done. The feast has gone on so long that time itself has lost its shape. Was it an hour ago that the birds burst out of the pie? 2 hours since the trenches collapsed into sludge? Or has it been days, each one stitched together by the endless cycle of platters and jugs? You cannot be sure anymore. The torches are still burning, but the wax drips thick, fat tears pooling down the iron holders. Smoke lingers above the tables in grey clouds, glowing orange at the edges where the firelight catches. Around you, the guests are no longer diners. They are soldiers in the campaign of overeating, each body showing the marks of defeat in its own way. Some slump against the table, eyes glassy, heads bobbing as though invisible waves rock them to sleep. Others stagger to their feet with manic determination, raising goblets high, their laughter edged with hysteria. A man a few seats down beats the table with his fist in rhythm to a song only he remembers, his face red and slick, his voice cracking as he shouts the same verse again and again. This is what a medieval feast becomes when the night stretches past its natural limits. The body buckles, the mind unravels. It is part of the ritual, expected even, for at least some guests to collapse outright, to eat until they faint, to drink until they fall. This is not disgrace but proof of devotion, a badge of loyalty to the host's generosity. Moderation is treason in a hall built to overflow. You watch as one guest leans too far sideways and tips from the bench, landing with a dull thud in the rushes. For a moment no one moves, then laughter breaks out, loud and sharp, as if collapse itself is part of the entertainment. Dogs rush to sniff at the fallen body, tails wagging. Servants arrive, dragging the guest away by the arms, leaving a wet trail where the rushes yield their secrets. In minutes the space is filled again, the table closing ranks, the rhythm of feasting uninterrupted. The air grows stranger now. The mixture of smells is overwhelming. Stale ale, sour sweat, roasting fat, damp rushes, human waste. The heat presses in, heavy as wool. Your head swims. You rub your eyes, but the torchlight burns through your lids, leaving after-images that dance with the shadows. Laughter sounds distant, warped, as though the hall itself has grown cavernous and hollow. The clatter of knives becomes a kind of drum beat, relentless, echoing in your chest. Some guests enter a stage of madness fueled by exhaustion and excess. One begins to sing a hymn, solemn and off-key, while another climbs onto the table to dance, stomping his boots into trenches until they split and spill. Women shriek with laughter, slapping the table in approval, their hands sticky with honey and grease. Someone throws a bone into the crowd and a brawl erupts between dogs and children to claim it. A goblet crashes, wine spilling like blood across the table. A man dips his hand into it and smears it across his face like paint, roaring with triumph. This was not unusual. Chronicles and poems describe feasts that lasted not merely hours but entire nights, where drunkenness tipped into chaos. Fights broke out over insults imagined or real. Servants struggled to keep the peace while also dodging thrown bones and goblets. And sometimes the madness turned deadly. Knives were everywhere. Tempers rose quickly when ale soured the blood. More than one medieval feast ended with blood spilled not on the trenches but on the floor. You grip the edge of the bench, steadying yourself as the madness swirls around you. The music has lost all tune. A bagpipe drones while voices shout over it, discordant, each singer desperate to be heard. Dogs bark, children scream, someone retches in the corner. The room is no longer a hall. It is a storm, a chaos that shakes your stomach as much as the food itself. Your own body begins to falter. The heaviness in your belly shifts into sharp cramps. Your mouth tastes sour, your throat tightens. Sweat beads on your temples, cold this time, a warning. You close your eyes, hoping for relief, but the madness follows you inward. The heat, the smell, the sound. All of it presses against you, relentless, until you feel the world tilting. You open your eyes quickly, clinging to the table with both hands. You cannot collapse. Not here. Not in this hall where collapse is spectacle. Around you, others are not so lucky. Another man falls, this one vomiting as he goes. The rushes absorb some of it, but the smell erupts instantly, sharp and acidic, mixing with the heavy perfume of meat and sweat. The crowd laughs again, raising their goblets in mock salute, as though the body's failure is part of the feast performance. This is survival in the middle of a medieval banquet. Not just enduring the food or the drink, but enduring the collapse of those around you. The madness that seeps into the hall when too much has been consumed, too much has been sung, too much has been endured. The feast is not over yet. Somehow, impossibly, more courses are waiting, and you know that before the night ends, more bodies will fall to the floor, more laughter will mask discomfort, and the line between celebration and catastrophe will blur until there is no difference at all. At last, the roar of the hall begins to dim. The music slows, voices slur, and even the dogs collapse into greasy piles beneath the benches. Torches burn low, dripping wax onto tables already slick with fat and wine. What remains in the hall is not triumph, but aftermath. And in the aftermath, the true disaster of a medieval feast reveals itself: the clean-up. You sit back, stomach still aching, and take in the battlefield around you. The tables are strewn with bones gnawed down to splinters, half-eaten pies congealing into lumps, and trenchers sagging into sludge. Goblets lie tipped over, some cracked, their contents pooled into sticky lakes across the wood. The air is no cleaner for the silence, it is worse. The warmth of bodies has faded, leaving behind only the concentrated stench of rotting food, sour ale, and unwashed flesh. Servants begin their grim work. They move slowly, exhausted, scraping trenchers into baskets already sagging with grease. Each trencher makes a wet, sucking sound as it peels from the table, heavy with meat juice, stale bread, and whatever microbes festered in the rushes below. Some trenchers are still eaten later by the poor, though by now they are as much hazard as charity. The rushes themselves are beyond saving. Hours of spills have transformed them into a pulpy mat, a swamp underfoot. Bones crunch as they are stepped on, hidden beneath the reeds. Somewhere a rat darts, emboldened by the sudden quiet. The smell is unbearable. Rancid fat, sour wine, the acrid tang of vomit, and the sharp edge of waste. Servants rake the rushes into piles, their baskets sagging with the weight of filth, then haul them outside to middens already heaped with refuse. The refuse yard becomes its own grotesque spectacle. Pigs root through the piles, their snouts slick with grease as they grunt happily. Dogs scavenge the discarded bones, fighting over scraps. Birds wheel overhead, swooping to snatch bits of bread and fat. The waste seeps into the earth, running into ditches, mingling with chamber pot slop tossed from windows. What fed the lords tonight feeds the vermin tomorrow, and the line between banquet and midden is thinner than anyone admits. Inside, the tables must be scrubbed. There is no soap, no disinfectant, only sand and water. Servants sprinkle sand across the wood, then scrape it with rough cloths, grinding the grit into grease. The result is not clean, only less visibly dirty. The smell lingers, soaked into the grain, impossible to erase. Over time, the tables themselves become saturated, permanently reeking of smoke and fat, like great wooden sponges. The goblets and platters fare no better. Pewter plates are rinsed in buckets of water already black with grease. Wooden bowls soak up flavour like trenchers, growing sourer with every use. Knives are wiped on cloth stiff with old food, their edges never fully free of grease. There is no sterilisation, no proper washing, only the ritual of scraping away the obvious. What remains becomes tomorrow's inheritance, and then there is the floor. The rushes may be gone, but what lies beneath them is worse. Stains soak the planks, sticky patches that glisten in torchlight. Ale, wine, blood, vomit, urine, all seep through, leaving black scars in the wood. The hall never truly recovers. Every feast leaves its mark, a layer added to the smell, the grime, the very fabric of the building. The walls darken, the beams drip soot, the floor grows soft with rot. The banquet hall itself is a body slowly poisoned by its own rituals. You watch as servants stagger under the weight of buckets carried out to cesspits, their faces blank with exhaustion. For them, the feast does not end when the last goblet is drained. It ends in back-breaking labour, in stench that clings to their clothes and hair, in sickness that follows them home. Many fall ill more often than the guests, their hands raw from raking, their lungs full of smoke and rot. And yet, this is not a rare event. Feasts come again and again, for holy days, for weddings, for treaties, for victories, for excuses. The hall is cleaned just enough to be dirtied again. The same cycle repeats, each time leaving the servants more tired, the hall more ruined, the guests more vulnerable to the invisible legacies of filth. The morning after a feast is a quieter kind of horror. Guests stumble home, pale and sluggish, their bodies negotiating terms with what they've consumed. The hall sits hollow, stripped of its chaos, reeking of what was left behind. Dogs sniff through the corners, servants scrub until their fingers crack, and outside the midden steams under the morning sun. This is the end of a medieval feast. Not glory, not triumph, not joy, but filth. A battlefield of grease and germs that no one truly wins. And yet, even now, plans are being made for the next one. You might think the feast ends with the morning clean-up, with trenchers dumped into the midden and ale-stained benches left to dry in the sun. But the real feast continues inside every body that sat at that table, and it does not end quickly. The first toll is obvious: indigestion. Medieval medical texts warned against eating too much meat, too much spice, too much sugar, too much of anything. Physicians spoke of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, and how food could disrupt their balance. Overeating was said to make the blood too thick, to flood the body with phlegm, or to spark bile into fiery rages. You don't need humoral theory to know they were onto something. By sunrise, half the hall is doubled over, suffering the slow churn of intestines that have been stuffed with spoiled pork, greasy stews, and sticky sugar loaves. But the toll is not only immediate. Feasting often left scars that stretched across months, even years. One of the most notorious was gout, the disease of kings. Too much rich meat, too much wine, too much sugar crystallized in the joints, leaving them red, swollen, and agonizingly painful. Chroniclers gleefully recorded noblemen hobbling about with swollen toes, carried in litters because their bodies had betrayed them. Gout became a mark of status, proof that one had access to foods most could never afford. In other words, illness itself became a badge of wealth. Obesity was another visible consequence. In a world where famine was always a threat, most peasants lived lean lives, their bodies shaped by scarcity. The wealthy, however, grew round, their bellies and faces swollen by decades of indulgence. Portraits from the later Middle Ages often depict corpulent lords, their girths barely constrained by fine tunics. For some, size was a display of prosperity. For others, it was a stumbling block, making armour harder to wear, travel harder to endure, and disease easier to catch. And disease was everywhere. The immune systems of the wealthy were tested constantly by the feasts they so adored. Spoiled meat carried food poisoning. Stagnant ale could harbour mould and toxins. Contaminated trenchers passed germs from hand to hand, spreading coughs, fevers, and infections. The feast itself became an incubator, a breeding ground for illness that spilled out into the household and beyond. More than one outbreak of dysentery or flux, what we would call infectious diarrhea, began at a banquet table and spread like wildfire through a town. But the toll was not purely physical. Feasts drained resources. Grain that could have fed villages was poured into vats of ale. Spices that cost fortunes were ground into sauces that disguised rot. Livestock that might have provided steady food for months was slaughtered for one night's display. These were not meals of nourishment, but of spectacle. Feasts as theatre, proof of wealth and dominance. Yet behind the laughter and music lay the shadow of hunger, for peasants scraping scraps from discarded trenchers, and servants left with filth instead of food. You shift uncomfortably in your imagination, feeling the slow ache of joints swollen from salt and fat, the sluggishness of blood thick with grease, the heaviness of a body fed too often on excess. you realise the feast does not end when the hall empties. It lingers in swollen knees, aching bellies, and shortened lifespans. Medical remedies for these afflictions were harsh. Bloodletting to reduce humours, purgatives to cleanse the gut, laxatives brewed from herbs that promised relief but often delivered pain. For gout, some physicians recommended poultices of herbs or even ground up worms smeared on inflamed joints. For indigestion, a concoction of vinegar and pepper might be forced down. Remedies became as much a trial as the feast themselves, a cycle of indulgence and punishment that never broke. And yet, the culture of feasting endured. Despite the sickness, despite the toll, despite the knowledge that too much of everything made the body weak, medieval lords and ladies demanded more. Because the feast was not about health. It was about display. To be seen, to be admired, to be remembered as the one who provided so much that guests collapsed from excess. That was power. The sickness was simply collateral. You sit with the thought, your stomach heavy, your joints already aching in sympathy, and you realise the grim truth. The medieval feast was never designed for survival. It was designed for spectacle, for pride, for wealth measured in how sick you could make your guests and still be applauded for it. The hall may be empty now, but the consequences walk with you long after. The feast hall is a theatre of abundance. Platters of meat stacked high, trenchers overflowing with gravy, jugs of ale that never seem to empty. Candles burn late into the night, smoke curling into rafters blackened with soot from generations of indulgence. It is a spectacle so overwhelming that you almost forget what lies outside its doors. Almost. Step beyond the hall and the illusion shatters. The vast majority of people in the medieval world did not dine on spiced pork or candied almonds. They lived on bread, porridge, and thin pottage made from whatever vegetable survived the season. In times of plenty, peasants might enjoy an egg or a sliver of cheese. In times of scarcity, which was often, meals dwindled to scraps. Famine was never far. A bad harvest, a cold spring, too much rain or too little, and entire villages starved. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 is one of the most infamous examples. Heavy rains drowned crops, grain rotted in storage, livestock sickened, and hunger spread like wildfire. People ate bark, grass, even the flesh of horses and dogs. Chroniclers whisper about cannibalism, though whether fact or rumour, the desperation was real. An estimated 10 to 15% of Europe's population died, and yet in these same years feasts continued. Nobles still filled their halls with roasted meats and imported spices, still demanded displays of abundance even as peasants outside their gates chewed on weeds. The contrast was grotesque. While one table collapsed from overindulgence, entire villages wasted away. This was no accident. Feasting was a declaration of power precisely because famine stalked so close. To host a banquet in lean years was to say, I have food when others starve. I control life and death. Guests gorge not just to fill their stomachs, but to bask in borrowed security, to taste survival even as the world outside failed. Every bite was a performance of privilege. The trenchers you left behind at last night's banquet, soggy bread, soaked with grease and germs, are carried outside now. Servants toss them to the poor, who wait with outstretched hands. To them, this waste is a blessing. Never mind that the bread is sour, the gravy spoiled, the risk of sickness high. Hunger strips away hesitation. Better to gamble with a bellyache than endure another night of nothing. And so, the feast feeds famine, not through generosity but through scraps and hazards disguised as charity. The irony is sharper when you recall that so much of this abundance was built on scarcity itself. The spices that drowned the taste of spoiled meat came from faraway lands, each ounce worth its weight in silver. The sugar sculpted into castles could have sustained villages if spent on grain. The endless jugs of ale drained stores of barley that might otherwise have been bread. The feast was not only indifferent to famine, it was one of its engines, Imagine standing outside the hall in the mud and rain, listening to the laughter spilling through the wooden doors. The torches glow from within, the smell of meat drifts out, the sound of music carries across the yard. You stand hungry, your stomach twisted with emptiness, while inside trenchers are discarded half-eaten, goblets spilled carelessly, and servants drag baskets of waste to the midden. That is the medieval feast. Not only a danger to those inside, but an insult to those outside. Even those within the hall could not escape famine's shadow. The very excess of feasting was partly born of fear. To gorge today was to prove you had food enough to waste. Who knew what tomorrow would bring? Who knew which winter would strip the barns bare? Which spring would drown the fields? In that sense, every bite was not just indulgence, but defiance. Eat now, because famine will come. And so, feasts and famines lived side by side, each feeding the other. The hall's abundance drew sharper lines against the hunger outside its walls. Scarcity made excess more powerful, and excess made scarcity more cruel. You sit in the hall, belly heavy, air thick with grease, and realise that you're not only surviving a feast, you're surviving a performance of wealth built on hunger. Every bite you chew is both a privilege and a curse. Every swallow is proof that survival here is never just about food. It is about who has it and who does not. By now you've learned that the medieval feast was never about nourishment. It wasn't even really about pleasure. It was about power. Every trench of greasy bread, every jug of ale, every bird stuffed into a pie was a message. Look how much I can waste, and look how much you must endure to prove your loyalty to me. The feast was a theatre, and you, along with every other swollen-bellied guest, were the cast. Your role wasn't just to eat, it was to be seen eating, to chew and gulp and belch in rhythm with the host's generosity. Every groan of discomfort was an act of tribute. Every bite you forced down after your stomach begged you to stop was a silent oath. You belonged here, under the roof of someone powerful enough to feed you until you broke. Feasting cemented alliances. A marriage contract was sealed not with a whisper, but with a banquet. A peace treaty became believable only after both sides stuffed themselves at the same table. Loyalty oaths were toasted with goblets of wine, and to refuse the goblet was to refuse the oath. In this way, your stomach became your signature, your loyalty written in grease and wine stains rather than ink. The seating itself was political. You would not choose your place. You were placed, measured, ranked. Closer to the high table meant favour. Further down meant something less. To be near the host was an honour. To be seated by the dogs and servants at the far end was humiliation disguised as hospitality. Even the trenchers told a story. Fresh bread for some, stale slabs for others. Everyone ate, but not everyone ate equally. And the host knew this. Every course was designed not only to overwhelm but to impress. The spices, the sugar, the endless flow of ale, these were currencies. To be seen serving them was to remind everyone that while famine stalked outside, plenty reigned within these walls. The feast was propaganda, staged as surely as a battle or a parade. It shouted wealth, stability and command louder than any herald could. This is why excess mattered more than taste. Nobody cared if the meat was spoiled, if the wine was sour, if the sugar grated like sand. What mattered was the sheer volume, that you could provide enough to drown your guests in meat, that the ale jugs never emptied, that the trenchers piled high enough to be thrown away half-eaten. Waste itself was the weapon. To destroy food in a hungry world was to declare your dominance over it. Even entertainment had its role in politics. Jesters mocked rivals in thinly veiled jokes. Masks performed moral allegories, with enemies symbolically defeated through pageantry. Live animals baked into pies or chained to tables were not merely amusements. They were metaphors for control, for the taming of chaos. And if a guest collapsed under the table from overindulgence, that too was useful. It proved the host's abundance was too much for a single body to withstand. But politics carried danger too. Feasts could be traps. Knives were everywhere, and tempers sharpened as quickly as blades under the heat of ale. More than one noble was assassinated at a banquet, cut down in a moment of revelry. Feasts were perfect stages for betrayal, the victim lulled by food, the hall too chaotic to notice until it was too late. In some accounts, lords even used poisoned dishes to eliminate rivals, though whether fact or rumour, the idea was plausible enough to keep guests paranoid. And still, you keep eating. You nod when the goblet is passed. You laugh at the jokes even as your belly twists. You know that your performance matters as much as your survival, because this is not just dinner. It is diplomacy. It is war played out on wooden tables instead of muddy fields. You glance at the high table where the host sits in finery, a mountain of food untouched before them. They eat little, but their power is measured not in their hunger, but in their ability to watch others suffer theirs. You realise suddenly that the true feast is not on the tables at all. The true feast is your obedience, your loyalty, your willingness to gorge yourself sick because someone wealthier told you to. And in that moment, as you force down another bite of meat glazed in spices that burn your throat, you understand the cruel brilliance of the medieval feast. It fed nobody, and yet it fed power completely. You sit in the smoky hall, belly tight, head foggy, but the truth presses in on you. None of this spectacle exists without the church's blessing. Religion saturates the medieval feast as surely as grease saturates the trenches. Every swallow, every goblet, every course has its shadow in faith. The calendar of the Middle Ages was divided not just into seasons of farming and war, but into seasons of fasting and feasting. Nearly half the year was technically meant to be fasting time. Lent, Advent, Ember Days, countless saints' days, when meat, eggs and dairy were forbidden. On paper, restraint reigned, but the very frequency of fasts created the hunger for spectacle when they ended. The feast was the pendulum's swing back, indulgence as the other side of discipline. The church did not just permit this, it orchestrated it. High feasts followed high masses, weddings, coronations, baptisms, all required banquets to manifest God's favour in meat and wine. The Eucharist itself, bread and wine as holy symbols, mirrored in grotesque abundance on the trestle tables. Eating was never just eating. It was performance of divine order, the proof that prosperity flowed down from heaven through the Lord's hand. Yet the church was not blind to the dangers. Monastic writers thundered against gluttony, naming it one of the 7 deadly sins. Sermons warned that overeating bred lust, sloth and madness. To gorge was to imperil the soul. And still, the same bishops who preached restraint presided over banquets where capons were stuffed with venison and tables sagged with imported wine. Hypocrisy sat at the high table, dressed in silk. Rules tried to keep balance. On fast days, meat was forbidden, but fish was allowed. The result was absurd. Rivers were emptied of fish, ponds stocked with eels, monasteries built elaborate fish pond systems to keep up with demand. Wealthy households circumvented rules with ingenuity, creating dishes that blurred lines. Almond milk stood in for cow's milk. Faux roasts were shaped from fish to look like pork. In Lent, cooks roasted dolphins and porpoises, classifying them as fish of the sea. Holy restraint was observed, at least in form, while the spirit of gluttony still thrived. The hall around you now echoes this tension. A priest blesses the table at the start, hands raised in pious gesture, but the blessing has long since drowned beneath the roar of ale. You glance at the host, who makes the sign of the cross before tearing into a dish so enormous it could feed a village. The contradiction is not hidden, it is embraced. To feast is to show God's favour, and to abstain at the wrong time is to insult him. But God's favour had a cruel edge. When famine struck, sermons claimed it was punishment for sin. When a barn was full enough to host a banquet, the same preachers praised divine generosity. The feast was not only about food, but about justification. It turned indulgence into a holy act, a visible sign that your Lord, your host, was chosen. You chew slowly on a greasy bite, the spices burning your tongue, and realize how little choice you have in this theatre. Religion blesses the feast, politics enforces it, hunger ensures you participate. Refusal would be heresy, moderation would be mockery. So you swallow again, the sauce heavy, the bread sodden, and tell yourself you're not just eating. You're participating in divine order, in holy indulgence. And yet, as your stomach churns, you feel the irony tightening inside you. If gluttony is a sin, then this hall is a cathedral to it. If humility is holy, then these trenches are blasphemy. The contradiction sits heavier than the food. This is the medieval feast, not just a spectacle of grease and power, but a sacrament of excess, wrapped in holy words that make you wonder whether salvation lies beyond the table, or if the table itself is proof you've already lost it. The feast is supposed to be abundance, spectacle, proof of power, but the very chaos that makes it grand also makes it dangerous. In a hall full of knives, fire, and boiling resentment, things often went very wrong. You grip the edge of the table as another platter lands with a thud, juices splattering across your sleeves. The hall is hot, noisy, and unsteady, yet beneath the surface hums a sharper tension. Everyone knows that a medieval feast could turn from theatre to tragedy in an instant. The first fear is poison. Chroniclers whisper of rivalries ended with a spiced dish that burned more than it should have, or a goblet of wine that never should have been drunk. Poison was feared precisely because feasts invited vulnerability. Everyone ate, everyone drank, everyone lowered their guard in public. Whether real or rumour, poison haunted every banquet. Noblemen employed tasters, servants who sampled dishes before their lords dared. Imagine being that servant, raising a goblet with shaking hands, wondering if this would be the sip that ended you. The paranoia was justified. Records from Italy, France, and England mentioned suspicious deaths after feasts, though proving intent was nearly impossible. Was it poison, or simply rancid food? The line was thin, and the suspicion constant. Fire was another danger. Torches gutter along the walls, their flames licking too close to tapestries that hang heavy with centuries of grease. The central hearth roars, sparks shooting upward, smoke thickening under the rafters. Performers sometimes dance with fire, jugglers tossing torches through the smoky air. A single misstep, a single dropped torch, and the hall could blaze like a furnace. In 1393, during a masquerade at the French court known as the Bal des Ardents, costumed dancers covered in pitch and feathers caught fire during a performance. Several nobles burned alive before horrified guests. Feasting and fire were inseparable, and fire always waited for its chance. And then there is the violence. The ale loosens tongues, the wine sharpens tempers. Old grudges bubble up between toasts. A laugh is taken as an insult. A joke cuts too deep. Knives are everywhere, not just for carving meat, but in every guest's hand. Fights erupted suddenly, a bench overturned, a goblet thrown, a dagger flashing in the firelight. One moment the hall echoed with laughter, the next with screams. Feasts that began as celebration sometimes ended in blood. Bodies sprawled across the rushes as though they were just another form of waste. You glance around and feel the tension yourself. The host sits at the high table, smiling too broadly, goblet raised too high. Across the hall, two men lock eyes, their laughter brittle, their hands tight on their knives. The music plays on, but the room seems to tilt towards something darker. You shift uneasily, aware that survival here is not only about enduring spoiled meat or sour ale. It is about escaping before the feast becomes a battlefield. The smell of smoke thickens. The torches hiss as tallow drips onto the floor. Somewhere a dog growls low, teeth bared, sensing the mood before the humans admit it. A servant stumbles, spilling a jug of ale into the fire pit. Flames leap up, licking higher, sparks showering onto the rushes. Guests laugh nervously, but the laughter sounds forced. The hall feels fragile now, as though one wrong move could shatter it. and you realise the truth. The medieval feast is not safe. It never was. It is not simply a test of your stomach, but of your luck. Will you walk away bloated and weary? Or will you be carried out, a casualty of poison, fire, or blade? The line between survival and disaster is as thin as the greasy cloth that pretends to be a table covering. As another toast rises and knives clatter, you force down the thought with the sour wine. But it lingers, heavy as the feast itself. Tonight could be the last meal anyone remembers you eating. The feast might look like power from the high table, but from the floor it is misery. You shift in your seat and glance at the servants weaving between benches, each one carrying more weight than most bodies could stand. They are the invisible hands that keep this grotesque theatre running, and their suffering is stitched into every bite you take. A boy no older than 12 staggers past with a trencher stacked high with meat. His face is red from the heat of the hearth. His tunic clings to his back with sweat. He trips on the uneven rushes, nearly falls, and catches himself just in time. A slice of pork slides to the floor, instantly claimed by a dog, its growls swallowed by the roar of the hall. The boy vanishes back into the kitchen, no one sparing him a glance. If he had fallen, the lash or the boot might have been his reward. The kitchen is no better. Beyond the hall's smoke is a different inferno, fires blazing in stone hearths, cauldrons of boiling stew hissing, carcasses hanging from hooks as flies swarm even in winter. Servants hack meat with dull blades, sweat dripping into pots, the floor slick with fat and ash. The stench is overwhelming, a mixture of blood, smoke and filth that clings to every servant long after the feast ends. Burnt arms, blistered hands, lungs choked with soot. These are the hidden costs of every course that arrives steaming before you. And then comes the serving itself. Carrying platters into the hall is dangerous work. Guests, drunk and boisterous, grab at the food before it lands, slopping grease across the servants' arms. Jesters mock them. Dogs snap at their heels. Children pull at their tunics. One wrong move, a dropped jug, a spilled trencher, and humiliation follows, sometimes worse. Records whisper of servants beaten, whipped, or dismissed for clumsiness. The feast demands perfection, even as it provides the worst possible conditions for achieving it. Cleanup is the final punishment. When the last goblet is drained and the last song fades, the servants begin their real labour. They scrape trenchers sodden with grease into baskets, their hands black with filth. They rake rushes that have become swamps of spit, vomit, and waste. They drag chamber pots outside, the contents sloshing onto their legs as they stumble in the dark. Rats scurry around them, dogs bark, pigs root through the refuse. The servants breathe it all in, choking on a stench that no perfume can mask. Sickness follows them. Dysentery, fevers, lung infections from the smoke, injuries from endless hauling. Few chroniclers wrote of their suffering, but you can see it in the shadows under their eyes, in their stooped backs, in the calluses that crack and bleed. The guests leave with stomach aches and headaches. The servants stay behind with wounds that never heal. And yet, without them, the feast collapses. They are the invisible scaffolding holding the spectacle upright. Every noble's reputation for generosity, every political alliance sealed with wine, every religious blessing draped over the table. All of it depends on servants who will never taste the sugar sculptures they carry, or the spiced wine they pour. They live the feast, but never enjoy it. As you watch another servant stagger past, his arms full of greasy trenchers that sag like sponges, you realise the cruel truth. Survival here is not just about enduring spoiled meat or sour ale. It is about enduring the exploitation that keeps the system alive. The feast consumes food, but it also consumes people. And the servants, like the rushes underfoot, are meant to be replaced when they collapse. You shift uncomfortably on the bench, belly churning, and realise you're not alone. Under the table, behind the benches and in the rafters above, The feast belongs just as much to the animals as to the humans. This hall is not a sealed-off world of order, but a living ecosystem, and the beasts thrive on what the guests spill, discard, or simply forget to guard. The first to notice are the dogs. They have been here since the feast began, pacing at your feet, their noses twitching at every waft of grease. They snap up bones the moment they hit the rushes, fight with snarls over scraps of meat, and shove their snouts into trenches abandoned by guests too stuffed to finish. They are not pets in the modern sense, but half-working, half-feral creatures, tolerated for their appetite and loathed for their persistence. When a dog fights too loudly or leaps for a trencher, it is kicked under the table, only to circle back seconds later. Above the dogs lurk the rats. They emerge from shadows when the hall grows loudest, scuttling along the edges, darting across beams slick with soot. The feast is paradise for them. A rain of crumbs, spilled ale, and abandoned trenchers ripe for chewing. Some gnaw directly at the baskets carried by servants, squeaking as they burrow into soggy bread. Others wait until night, when the hall empties, then swarm the refuse left behind. Their teeth scrape wood, their droppings scatter across the rushes, and their presence spreads sickness long after the torches are snuffed. Birds too intrude. The rafters are alive with pigeons and sparrows that slip through gaps in the roof. They swoop down to snatch crusts, scattering feathers onto the greasy tables. Sometimes their presence is intentional, released as spectacle. Live doves hidden inside pies, fluttering out to the crowd's delight, their panic lost in the laughter. But most of the time, they are pests, fouling the benches, adding their droppings to the filth already thick on the floor. Cats slink through the chaos as well, tolerated for their skill at hunting rats, despised for their habit of leaping onto tables to paw at roasted meats. Guests shout and shoo them, but their hunger is as stubborn as the dogs. They hiss when kicked away, their eyes glowing in torchlight, vanishing only to reappear at the next platter. Even livestock sometimes wandered the edges of a feast. Chickens escaped pens and strutted boldly among the trenches, pecking at scraps. Pigs rooted through middens outside and sometimes shoved their way in, grunting happily at the banquet spilled across the rushes. Horses tethered in nearby stables added their smell to the stew of the hall, a reminder that the feast existed in a world of manure and beasts, not sanitized dining rooms. The noise is constant. Dogs barking, rats squeaking, birds flapping, cats yowling. It mingles with the coughs, laughter, and songs of the guests until the line between human and animal blurs. The hall is a barn masquerading as a palace, and survival here means ignoring that your food shares space with creatures that lick, bite, and claw at the same scraps you do. Medieval chroniclers sometimes laughed about this, noting dogs stealing roasts from under the noses of lords, or cats leaping onto tables mid-prayer. To modern eyes, it looks like filth. To medieval ones, it was normal. Animals were part of the household, part of the chaos, part of the feast. Their presence was tolerated because there was no way to banish them. And yet, you cannot shake the feeling as you eat another greasy bite. You are not feasting alone. Every swallow is shared with a dog licking marrow from bones, with a rat gnawing bread in the shadows, with a bird circling overhead. The feast is not just human excess, it is animal survival. And when the guests stagger home, bloated and groaning, the beast will remain, finishing what you could not. The real winners of the medieval banquet are not the nobles at the high table. They are the dogs under the benches, the rats in the rafters, and the birds who swoop in to steal their fill. You surface before the sun because your stomach refuses to let you sleep. The bed is not a refuge. The ticking itch of straw pricks through the sheet, and the whole palate smells faintly damp, as if yesterday's heat seeped into it and decided to stay. Your mouth is thick, your tongue feels like a wool mitten, and the air is cold enough to sharpen every ache left by the bench. Somewhere in the room, a body snores with heroic determination. Somewhere in your abdomen a slow wheel turns and refuses to stop. Morning makes last night honest. In the darkness, the hall offered noise to distract you from what you had done to yourself. In the grey light, there is nothing but reckoning. The first cough you push out tastes like ashes and stale fat. Your throat scratches the way rafters scratch the sky after a long winter of smoke. You swallow, then force yourself upright, and your belly answers with a warning. It is not rage yet. It is a legal notice that rage is coming. You pull on a tunic that smells of last night's feast and carry yourself outside because movement is medicine when you have very few options. The yard beyond the hall is slick with frost, and the puddles are skinned with ice that breaks with soft sigh under your boot. The air is cold and clean, so clean that your lungs sting with the shock of it. You stand there and breathe in until your belly grudges you a little space. Far off, a rooster attempts bravado. Crows do it better. They sound like laughter that has seen too much. The kitchen is already awake. It is always awake. Knives thud against blocks. Someone rakes coals back to flame. Water hisses in iron and releases a smell that is almost a cure. Wet heat. Steam that does not stink of tallow. A servant shoulders out of a side door with a basket of refuse for the midden. An overnight frost turns the grease into a pale crust that cracks along the edges like old paint. Pigs in the yard lift their heads at the sound and shuffle forward, gladder than any guest that a feast has ended. You're not ready for food, but medieval morning has a few mercies and every house remembers them. Barley water left steeping in a pot. Thin ale called small because it offends the senses less, and offends the humours less as well. Oat pottage that looks dull because it is, and the dullness is exactly what your stomach demands. You sip. The warmth descends like a hand pressed lightly over a horse's eyes, calming without forcing sleep. You thank whatever saint supervises mornings and feel a first small peace. The body you live in has opinions formed by a calendar full of indulgence and denial. The church sets fasts as firmly as seasons set harvests, and the pendulum between restraint and riot is the way the year breathes. Lent pulls you thin. Easter pushes you wide again. Ember days ask for modesty. Weddings laugh at modesty and call for capons. Your stomach learns the rhythm even if your mouth pretends not to. It forgives many sins because it must. It also keeps notes. You walk the yard slowly and count the notes. The sour rot that spice could not hide. The gritty sweetness of sugar that should have been treasure and instead became ache. The ale that carried safety from water but also carried its own roughness. The trenchers that soaked up the worst parts of every dish and then pretended to be bread. The dogs that underlined everything with their enthusiasm. The smoke that turned lungs into chimneys. The rushes that pretended to be a flaw and failed. Your belly remembers, and the morning confirms. A servant passes you with a stack of wooden bowls for scouring. Sand will do the work because there is no better tool at hand. You watch her rub grit into yesterday until the surface looks almost new, then rinse with water that steam cannot purify. In city houses, the grey water will go into lanes and drains that lead to rivers where women wash linen and children play. In country houses, it will sink into earth that also receives the night's chamber pots. You understand at once why clean water was suspicion, and weak ale was comfort. Brewing boiled what streams could not. Inside the hall, the waking continues. Someone opens shutters, and light falls into the room like a charitable thought that arrived late. The smell it reveals is frank and unforgiving. Burnt fat, stale wine, wet dog, human sweat that decided to stay. The rushes are raked into mounds, then shouldered toward the door. Underneath them, the floorboards show their bruises. Some stains are old and black, some glisten new. The house wears feasts the way a soldier wears scars. You cannot scrape away history. You can only scatter new reeds and pretend they smell like herbs. You drink more barley water and feel brave enough to think of actual food. Bread first, because bread is the fence line you build around a damaged field. It is yesterday's loaf, hard at the edge, and still soft at the core. You cut a slice and chew it a long time. The work of chewing tells your stomach that you're not attacking it, and your stomach, which believes very little now, allows the bread to pass with minimal protest. Someone brings a dish of stewed apples cooked down until they're almost a sauce. You eat 3 spoonfuls and become a better person. History wrote about mornings like this, though it preferred to do so in the margins of sermons and the corners of housekeeping books. Physicians advise gentle walking for an uneasy belly, and warn against sleep after a heavy meal because vapours will rise and confuse the head. They prescribe fennel for wind, mint for griping, ginger for a cold stomach, and anise to help what is stuck to continue its travels. Many households keep these in small jars like quiet friends. You pick at a pinch of fennel and understand why generations have thanked it without ceremony. If you are unlucky, the morning brings the sharper end of last night's indulgence. There are fevers that feel like a hot coal shoved behind your eyes. There is flux that sends you running every few minutes to a corner everyone pretends is private. There is the cramp that comes in waves and persuades you to make vows you will forget. This is when remedies show their teeth. A purgative of senna curled into honey. A draught of vinegar and pepper that burns like apology. A clyster that no one wants to discuss even though everyone knows it sits in the chest as faithfully as the pewter plates sit in the cupboard. Medieval medicine is stern but not foolish. It knows very well what rich food does to real bodies. If you are luckier, your reckoning is lighter and arrives as a list of small penalties. A head that complains with every loud noise. A mouth that tastes like the bottom of a barrel. A heaviness behind the ribs that argues against sudden movements or laughter. These penalties will fade by noon if you behave, which is precisely why you may not behave. Work waits, and work does not respect delicate stomachs. You bend to lift a pail and your belly warns you. You straighten and the warning becomes instruction. You put the pail down and adjust your plan because intelligence is the art of not repeating mistakes before lunch. Outside the village stirs. A cart creaks past with wheels that argue against frost. 2 dogs argue against each other with the same commitment. Smoke rises from small chimneys and does not smell like feast smoke. It smells like families trying to keep a space warm without taking the taste of fire into their pillows. A child runs by with a crust in one hand and a length of string in the other, and you remember that most mornings are not spent recovering from abundance. They are spent preparing to avoid scarcity. You think of famine because abundance always calls famine to mind, the way excess calls shame. The years 1315 to 1317 sit in the memory of Europe like a bruise that never fully faded. Rains came and did not stop. Grain rotted where it stood. Livestock sank into mud and sickness. People ate what they could find and learned exactly how much bark a human can chew before teeth give up. The estimates of loss are numbers, but even if the numbers argued with each other, the truth is a weight you can feel this morning. Feasts in such years meant more than display. They taunted. They made morning after feel like treason performed by a stomach. Your own morning is smaller than history and larger than last night's bravado. You drink small ale that tastes like promise. You walk slowly so your joints remember their names. You let your belly decide the speed of your decisions. If someone offers spiced wine at breakfast, you smile and put your hand over your cup, because you have learned at least one thing. If someone passes a tray with march pane left from the high table, you smile again and pretend to be pious. Piety is reasonable theatre when sugar is involved. By mid-morning your skin feels less like an outfit borrowed from a stranger. The fog in your head lifts enough for thoughts to stretch. You pass the hall again and see the door propped open to let the inside breathe. The air that escapes is not kind. It shoulders past you like a giant who has decided to leave and does not apologise for the space it fills. A servant props a broom against the lintel and rubs her wrists. You nod at each other because nodding is a language that does not require the stomach to participate. The rest of the day writes itself. If you work a field, you will make peace with the idea that you will move more slowly, and that is fine because the soil is frozen and your body is more important than your haste. If you make things with your hands, you will sit in the light and let your fingers remember their cleverness without asking them to be strong. If you manage a household, you will count the supplies and do the arithmetic that feasts ignore. If you serve, you will prepare for the next event with the patience of a person who knows a cycle when they see one. Toward noon, hunger returns like a well-mannered visitor who knocks before entering. You allow it, but you choose what it eats. Broth is the safest country. Bread is the safest map. A little cheese if the stomach accepts the treaty. Perhaps a pear if stores have been kind and you can stomach a sweetness that grew on a tree rather than in a vat. The body rewards this diplomacy at once. The pressure eases. The skin cools. You find the patience to listen to human voices without wishing them mute. Afternoon is when the moral arrives. It never arrives at night. Night applauds and dares and misleads. Morning scolds. Afternoon teaches. The lesson is the same every time, and somehow always surprising. Survival at a medieval feast is not heroic. It is an administrative task. You trim the edges of injury with care. You pace your remedies. You do not argue with a gut that has already won the argument. You let the body be ordinary so that you may be alive tomorrow when the calendar invents a new reason to pretend moderation is a boring sin. There are costs you will not feel today. The joints that collected salt and complaint will speak louder in winter after years of these nights. The veins that work too hard will make your ankles throb after long rides. The healer will take your arm and your blood and insist that colour tells stories. You will chew fennel until you're on friendly terms with it, and keep a pouch of mint in your belongings the way others keep charms. You will say you will never again eat lamprey and then eat it because the host is proud and you are polite. The morning will collect these promises and store them neatly with the ones you broke last season. Evening comes with its quiet. The sky burns and then fades. The hall glows again, not with frenzy, but with the homely light of work and bread, and a modest pot that does not boil angrily. You pass the door and listen without entering. The wood holds heat like an old friend. The floor looks almost civilized beneath a fresh scatter of herbs that pretend to be meadows. You could go in. You do not. You walk on because your stomach is writing a new policy, and you are trying to be a wise subject. Night falls, and you lie down on straw that has given up arguing against your bones. Your belly makes a final comment, not unkind. You pull the blanket to your chin and realize something ridiculous. You are content, not triumphant, not proud, not amused, simply content. It is not a feeling feasts are built to deliver, which is why mornings must rescue it. You will sleep. You will wake with a mouth that tastes normal. You will look at bread and not feel threatened. You will remember the sight of a pie releasing birds, and know that it is more interesting as a story than as a meal. You will nod when the next invitation arrives, because saying no is a political act you cannot afford. You will prepare as soldiers prepare for campaigns. You will bring fennel. You will pace your cups. You will eat the bread first instead of last. You will sit near a door if you can, not for escape, but for air. For now, the house quiets. Even the pigs settle. The river keeps its counsel. Your body forgives you just enough to make future mistakes possible. That is the real mercy of the morning after. It does not lecture you into virtue. It returns you to ordinary life with a receipt you can actually pay. You're not cured. You're simply alive, which is the correct outcome. Tomorrow will bring labour that scrubs away the last film of feast smoke. Tomorrow will bring gossip that reduces excess to jokes. Tomorrow will bring a new complaint from your joints and a new promise from your mouth. These are tolerable. These are familiar. These are human. You survived the night. You are surviving the day. You will survive the next invitation. Not because the feast became kinder, but because the morning taught you how to get through it, without trading your good sense for a goblet. That is the secret no minstrel sings and no jester mocks. Survival here is careful, slow, and slightly stubborn. It tastes like barley water and bread. It smells like cold air and clean steam. It sounds like your own breath finally even again. You turn on your side. The straw shifts. Your belly gives one last comment, then rests. Outside, frost tightens its grip on the yard. Inside, sleep takes you back without asking whether you deserve it. And there you have it, the medieval feast. Living proof that if cholesterol doesn't get you, dysentery will. A night of greasy trenches, sour ale, airborne pigeons and political side-eye. all wrapped up in a smell so bad it probably still lingers in that hall 600 years later. They said these banquets were about generosity, but really they were about survival. Surviving the meat, surviving the madness, and surviving the dog that tried to bite your leg under the table. Congratulations, you made it through. Sort of. So the next time you sit down to a microwaved pizza or scroll through takeout menus, remember, you could be gnawing rancid boar by torchlight while rats run across the rafters. Suddenly soggy fries don't sound so bad, do they? Now, if you're brave enough, stick around. Because I've got another story waiting. One that'll make you even more grateful for your dishwasher, your fridge, and the fact that no one expects you to wrestle a goose out of a pie before dessert.